The First World War is engraved in our collective consciousness as a monochromatic nightmare. It is the gray mud of Flanders, the brown rats of the trenches, the white chlorine gas drifting across a landscape stripped of all life. It is a story of industrial attrition, where men were fed into the meat grinder of the Western Front by the millions, dying for yards of blasted earth in a stalemate that stripped warfare of its last vestiges of romance. But if you spin the globe away from the freezing rain of northern Europe, down to the turquoise waters and blinding heat of the Indian Ocean, you will find a very different war. It was a campaign that felt less like the mechanized slaughter of the 20th century and more like a final brilliant echo of the age of sail. It was a campaign of wits, of audacity, of cat and mouse chases across thousands of miles of open sea, conducted with a level of chivalry that seems almost fictional to modern eyes. This is the story of the SMS Emden, a single German light cruiser that paralyzed the British Empire, and her captain, Karl von Müller, the man who would come to be known as the Gentleman Raider. To understand the legend, we must first understand the machine. The Emden was not a titan of the seas. She was not a dreadnought battleship, bristling with 12-inch guns and encased in impenetrable steel armor. She was a light cruiser of the Dresden class, commissioned in 1909. She was beautiful, sleek, three-funneled, and painted in a brilliant tropical white livery that earned her the nickname the Swan of the East. She was designed for speed, not a stand-up fight. Her armor was thin, her main battery consisted of 10 10.5-centimeter guns, pop guns compared to the heavy artillery of the British battle fleet, but she could make 24 knots, and in the hands of a capable crew, she was a precision instrument. In the summer of 1914, she was the jewel of the German East Asia Squadron, based in the German colonial concession of Tsingtao, China. Tsingtao in 1914 was a surreal place, a slice of Bavaria transplanted to the Pacific coast, complete with red-roofed villas and breweries, where German naval officers lived a life of colonial ease. But the man commanding the Emden, Fregattenkapitän Karl von Müller, was not a man of ease. Born in Hanover to a family of Prussian military nobility, Müller was 41 years old, a quiet, cerebral man with a gaunt, ascetic face. He suffered from recurring bouts of malaria, a souvenir from his earlier service in East Africa, which gave him a fragile appearance that belied a core of iron will. He was not the blustering, monocled stereotype of a Prussian officer. He was a student of naval history, a man who spoke softly but whose tactical instincts were predatory. When the Archduke was assassinated in Sarajevo and the dominoes of alliance began to tumble in July 1914, Müller knew that the idyllic days in Tsingtao were over. The German East Asia Squadron, commanded by the formidable Admiral Maximilian von Spee, was a powerful force, but it was homeless. Surrounded by the overwhelming naval might of Britain, France, Russia, and soon Japan, the squadron had no secure base to operate from. Their only hope was to run, to cross the vast expanse of the Pacific round Cape Horn and try to break through to Germany. It was a suicide pact in slow motion. But at a tense council of war on the volcanic island of Pagan in the Marianas, as the squadron coaled for its long voyage, Müller approached Admiral von Spee with a radical proposal. He argued that a fleet of heavy cruisers moving together was a hammer, but what Germany needed was a scalpel. The Indian Ocean, he pointed out, was a British lake. It was the vital artery of the British Empire, the sea lane through which the wealth of India, the rubber of Malaya, and the troops of Australia flowed to the mother country. Müller proposed that while the main squadron headed east, the Emden should be detached to head west, alone. A single fast raider, operating independently in the Indian Ocean, could cause panic out of all proportion to its strength. It would force the British to divert dozens of warships to hunt a single ghost. Von Spee, a man who understood the burden of command, looked at the small light cruiser and agreed. On August 14, 1914, the signal flags fluttered up the halyards. The Emden, accompanied only by her coal supply ship, the Markomannia, turned her bow toward the setting sun. The rest of the squadron steamed east, toward their eventual doom at the Battle of the Falkland Islands. The Emden was now alone. The moment she detached, the Emden effectively became a pirate ship. She had no friendly ports, she had no dry docks for repairs, she had no secure source of ammunition. But her most critical shortage was coal. In the age of steam, coal was life. The Emden was a hungry beast. At cruising speed, she burned 60 tons of coal a day. At full battle speed, she devoured 370 tons. To survive, she would have to feed. She would have to live off the land, or rather off the sea. This logistical reality transformed the lives of her crew. We often romanticize naval warfare as battles and glory, but for the men of the Emden, the war became a grueling cycle of backbreaking labor. Coaling at sea was a nightmare. Without the calm waters of a harbor, the Emden had to tie up alongside her collier in the open ocean. The two steel hulls would grind and heave against each other in the ocean swell, threatening to crush the men working between them. Massive sacks of coal were swung across on davits, spilling black dust everywhere. The tropical heat in the bunkers often reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The coal dust coated everything. It filled the men's lungs, it settled into their pores, it crunched in their food. And yet the morale of the crew was unbreakable. They knew they were on a suicide mission, lone wolves against an empire, and that knowledge forged a fanatical bond between the men and their gentleman captain. Miller's first weapon was silence. He knew the British had a network of listening stations across the Indian Ocean, so he ordered strict radio silence. The Emden became a hole in the world. Her wireless operators sat hunched over their receivers 24 hours a day, listening to the chatter of unsuspecting British merchant captains who, complacent in their belief that the Royal Navy ruled the waves, broadcast their positions and courses in the clear. Miller's second weapon was disguise. The Emden had 3 funnels. The British light cruisers of the Town class, which were hunting her, had 2 masts and 4 funnels. In a stroke of genius, Miller ordered his ship's carpenter to build a fake 4th funnel out of wood, canvas, and bamboo. When this structure was hoisted into place on the foredeck, the Emden's silhouette changed instantly. From a distance, she looked exactly like the HMS Yarmouth. It was a simple theatrical trick, but it would prove devastatingly effective. By early September 1914, the Emden had slipped unnoticed into the Bay of Bengal, positioning herself across the golden triangle of trade routes between Ceylon, Calcutta, and Singapore. The reign of terror began on September 10th. The first victim was the Greek collier Pontoporos, which Miller captured and, finding her full of coal, decided to keep as a floating gas station. Then came the British steamer Indus. The capture of the Indus set the template for the entire cruise. The Emden appeared out of the blue, firing a blank shot across the bow. The British captain, shocked to see a German warship in these waters, surrendered. A prize crew boarded the vessel, but instead of the brutality the British sailors expected, having been fed propaganda about the Huns, they were met with impeccable politeness. The German boarding officer apologized for the inconvenience. He allowed the British sailors to pack their personal belongings. He even offered them cigarettes. On one occasion, when the captain of the Indus complained that he didn't have any soap, Miller's men made sure he was supplied with soap and towels before his ship was scuttled. This was the Emden style. The captured crews were brought aboard the Emden or transferred to a supply ship. They were treated not as prisoners but as guests of the Kaiser. The officers were invited to the wardroom, dubbed Club Emden, where they drank beer, smoked cigars, and discussed the war with their German captors, as if it were a cricket match that had gotten slightly out of hand. The captures came thick and fast. The Lovett, a troop transport, was sunk. The Diplomat, a ship carrying 7,000 tons of tea, was sent to the bottom, a loss that reportedly caused more outrage in London drawing rooms than the loss of the ship itself. The Killen, the Trabuc, the Clan Matheson, ship after ship was intercepted, evacuated, and scuttled. Miller was fighting a war of destruction, not death. He took great care to ensure that not a single merchant sailor was killed or injured during these captures. When the number of prisoners aboard the Emden became unmanageable, Miller would capture a ship, load the hundreds of prisoners onto it, and release it as a cartel ship, sending them back to the nearest port. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. These released crews became Miller's best PR agents. They arrived in Calcutta or Colombo telling stories of the gentleman raider, the polite captain who apologized for sinking their ships and treated them with honor. The British press, initially hostile, began to grudgingly admire this sporting enemy. By late September, the Emden paralysis had gripped the Indian Ocean. Shipping insurance rates in London skyrocketed. Merchant captains refused to leave port. The great trade routes of the empire ground to a halt. The British Admiralty was humiliated. They had to divert over 60 warships, cruisers, destroyers, and even battleships from the European theater to hunt down this one solitary pest. But Muller knew that sinking merchant ships in the open ocean was not enough. He needed to strike a blow that would shake the political foundations of the British Raj. He needed to prove that Britain could not protect its jewel in the crown. He turned his eyes toward the coast of India. His target was Madras. On the night of September 22, 1914, the Emden slipped quietly toward the Coromandel coast. The city of Madras was ablaze with lights. The British authorities, arrogant in their belief that the war was a distant European affair, had not even ordered a blackout. At 9:30 p.m., the Emden closed to within 3,000 yards of the harbor. Muller ordered his searchlights on. The brilliant white beams cut through the tropical night, illuminating the massive white and red oil storage tanks of the Burma Oil Company standing like sentinels on the shore. Muller gave the order to fire. The Emden's starboard battery roared. The first few shells went high, but the German gunners quickly found their range. In 30 minutes, they pumped 125 shells into the harbor. The oil tanks erupted. A pillar of flame shot hundreds of feet into the night sky, visible for miles out to sea. 346,000 gallons of fuel were incinerated in a firestorm that burned for days. The psychological impact was nuclear. For the first time in centuries, a foreign warship had bombarded the coast of India. Panic swept the city. The British colonial administration looked helpless. Thousands of residents fled inland, clogging the railways. The myth of British invincibility was shattered in a single night of fire. The attack was so bold, so terrifyingly competent, that it permanently entered the local lexicon. To this day, in the Tamil language, the word Emden refers to someone who is street-smart, manipulative, daring, and impossible to pin down. A strict mother might call a mischievous child an Emden. It is a linguistic fossil of the night the war came to India. After Madras, the hunt for the Emden intensified to a fever pitch. The British were furious. Muller knew he had to disappear. He took the Emden south, vanishing into the remote waters of the Indian Ocean to clean his ship's bottom and rest his crew. He chose the tiny, isolated atoll of Diego Garcia in the Chagos archipelago. When the Emden steamed into the lagoon on October 9th, the crew manned their guns, expecting resistance. Instead, they were met by a boat from the local French copra plantation. The manager came aboard, smiling, with gifts of fruit and eggs. In a twist of irony fit for a movie script, Diego Garcia was so isolated that the mail ship hadn't arrived in months. They didn't know the war had started. They didn't know that the polite German captain drinking whiskey in their parlor was the most wanted man in the British Empire. Muller, ever the gentleman, didn't have the heart to spoil their ignorance. He told them the Emden was participating in world naval maneuvers. The Germans spent 2 days on the island, careening the ship to scrape barnacles off the hull, repairing the engines, and playing music. It was a surreal interlude, enemies breaking bread in paradise, separated only by the silence of the telegraph wires. When the Emden sailed on October 10th, the islanders waved them off, completely unaware of the history they had just brushed against. But the net was tightening. The Emden's primary collier, the Markomania, was captured and sunk by the British cruiser HMS Yarmouth on October 12th. Muller lost his main source of coal and his supply of spare parts. He was now living on borrowed time. He needed to keep moving, to keep the Allies off balance. He decided on his most audacious gamble yet. He would stop hiding and start hunting warships. He set a course for Penang, a major British harbor in Malaya. He knew it would be guarded. He knew enemy warships would be there. That was the point. In the pre-dawn darkness of October 28, 1914, the Emden approached the entrance to Penang Harbor. The fake fourth funnel was rigged. She flew the white ensign of the Royal Navy. In the gloom, the harbor sentries mistook her for the British cruiser HMS Yarmouth and let her pass without challenge. It was a Trojan horse on the high seas. Inside the harbor, the scene was one of peace. Anchored right in the center was the Russian-protected cruiser Jemchug. It was a scene of criminal negligence. The Russian ship was ablaze with lights, her guns were unmanned, no lookouts were posted, and her captain, Baron Cherkasov, was ashore. Reports suggest he was spending the night with a lady friend at the luxurious Eastern and Oriental Hotel. Muller showed no mercy. He brought the Emden to within 300 yards, point-blank range, and fired a torpedo. The torpedo hissed through the water and struck the Jemchug in the stern, lifting the Russian ship out of the water. As the Jemchug reeled, her sailors scrambling in confusion, the Emden's gunners opened up, pouring a withering fire into the Russian superstructure. The Emden turned, circled, and fired a second torpedo. This one struck the forward magazine. The explosion was catastrophic. A massive column of smoke, steel, and bodies shot into the air. The Jemchug was torn in half and vanished beneath the water in minutes, taking 89 sailors with her. It was a brutal execution. As the Emden turned to escape the now alerted harbor, she encountered a French destroyer, the Mousquet, returning from patrol. The small French ship was hopelessly outclassed, but she fought with desperate gallantry. She launched a torpedo and opened fire with her small guns, but the Emden's gunners, honed by months of war, tore her apart. The Mousquet sank quickly, and here, amidst the burning wreckage and the screams of dying men, the gentleman raiders surfaced again. Despite the danger, despite the fact that other enemy ships were in the harbor and raising steam, Miller stopped his ship. He lowered boats. He fished 36 French survivors out of the oil-slicked water. On deck, the German sailors blanketed the shivering Frenchmen, gave them brandy and cigarettes, and treated their wounds. The French sailors were stunned. They had been told by their officers that the Germans were barbarians who massacred prisoners. Instead, they were treated with a compassion that transcended the war. Miller later stopped a neutral merchant ship, the Newburn, and transferred the French survivors to her, exacting a promise that they be taken to a hospital. By November 1914, the Emden had been raiding for 3 months. She had sailed 30,000 miles, more than the circumference of the Earth. Her engines were worn out, her hull was fouled with tropical growth which slowed her speed, and her crew was exhausted, running on adrenaline and the charisma of their captain. Miller knew the end was inevitable. The odds were simply too great. But he had one more target in mind. The Cocos, Keeling Islands, are a remote speck of coral in the eastern Indian Ocean, but in 1914 they were a nerve center. They housed a critical wireless and cable station that linked Australia to England. Miller decided to destroy it, cutting the communications link between the continents. It was a strategic play, but it would prove to be his fatal mistake. On the morning of November 9th, the Emden arrived off Direction Island in the Cocos Group. Miller anchored and sent his executive officer, the fiery and capable Captain Lieutenant Helmuth von Mucke, ashore with a landing party of 50 men. Their orders were to blow up the radio mast and cut the undersea cables. The landing party, armed with rifles and machine guns, stormed the station, but the British staff on the island had been alert. The moment they saw the strange warship with the suspicious fourth funnel, they had tapped out a frantic distress signal. Strange warship off entrance. Then, SOS, Emden here. The Emden's jammers tried to block the signal, but it was too late. The message had gone out. Just 50 miles away, a massive Allied convoy was steaming toward the Middle East, carrying the first contingent of Anzac troops to the war. The convoy's escort included the powerful Australian light cruiser HMAS Sydney. The Sydney was a newer ship than the Emden. She was significantly faster, better armored, and most importantly, she was armed with 8 6-inch guns. These guns fired a shell that was 3 times heavier than the Emden's 4-inch shells, and they could fire from a much longer range. Upon receiving the SOS, the Sydney detached from the convoy and raced toward Cocos at full speed. On the Emden, lookouts spotted smoke on the horizon. At first, Miller hoped it was his supply ship, the Burlesque, but as the smoke thickened and the masts appeared, the truth became undeniable. It was a warship. It was the Sydney. Miller was caught in the worst possible tactical position. He was at anchor, his engines were cold, and 50 of his best men, his landing party, were stuck on the island. He sounded the siren to recall them, but there was no time. He had to make a terrible choice: stay and be destroyed at anchor or abandon his men and put to sea to fight. He chose to fight. The anchor was raised, the battle flags were hoisted, and the Emden steamed out to meet her executioner. The Battle of Cocos was tragic and one-sided. It was the first ship-to-ship battle in the history of the Royal Australian Navy, and the Sydney's captain, John Glossop, fought it with cold professional efficiency. He knew the Emden's guns had a shorter range, so he used his superior speed to keep the distance open. He pounded the German ship from long range, while the Emden's shells fell harmlessly into the sea or bounced off the Sydney's armor. The German gunners fought with desperate courage. They scored early hits, knocking out the Sydney's rangefinder, but it wasn't enough. The Sydney's 6-inch lyddite shells began to tear the Emden apart. The wireless room was destroyed. The electric steering gear failed, forcing the crew to steer the ship manually from the aft compartment, shouting orders through voice pipes that were soon severed. One by one, the Emden's funnels were blasted away. The foremast collapsed. Fires raged out of control amidships. The decks became a charnel house of twisted metal and shrapnel. For 90 minutes, Miller maneuvered his broken, burning ship, trying to close the range, trying to find an angle for a torpedo, but the Sydney was relentless. The Emden was reduced to a wreck, her guns falling silent as their crews were killed. Realizing that his ship was doomed and wanting to save the lives of the survivors, Captain Miller made his final command decision. He turned the Emden toward North Keeling Island and ran her hard aground on the coral reef at 19 knots. The ship hit with a grinding crash, shuddering to a halt in the surf. The cruise of the Swan of the East was over. The aftermath was messy and controversial. The Emden's battle flag was still flying from the mainmast. The Sydney, returning from chasing down the Emden's colliers, signaled, "Do you surrender?" Miller, dazed and unable to reach the signal halyards because of the fires, did not reply. Captain Glossop, bound by the rules of war which stated that a flying flag meant a ship was still fighting, fired 2 more salvos into the grounded wreck. These shells killed 20 more sailors who had already stopped fighting. Finally, a sailor managed to climb the mast and cut down the ensign. A white sheet was waved. The toll was heavy. 134 of the Emden's crew were dead, and 65 were wounded. But when Captain Miller was brought aboard the Sydney, filthy, exhausted, and defeated, Captain Glossop met him at the gangway. In a final act of the chivalry that had defined the entire campaign, Glossop refused to take Miller's sword. He shook his hand instead, congratulating him on a gallant fight. But the story does not end on that reef. There is one final, incredible chapter, the story of the men left behind. The 50-man landing party on Direction Island, led by Helmuth von Mucke, had watched the battle from the shore. They had seen their ship losing her funnels. They had seen her limp away over the horizon, burning. They knew she wasn't coming back. They were stranded on a British island surrounded by a hostile water. But von Mucke was not a man to surrender. In the harbor lay a 97-ton, 3-masted schooner named the Ayesha. She was old, she was rotting, and she was used to transport copra. She was the rottenest ship in the Indies, but she was their only hope. While the Sydney was distracted finishing off the Emden, von Mucke seized the Ayesha. They loaded her with water and provisions. The British staff on the island, displaying the bizarre sporting spirit of the era, actually helped the Germans load supplies and even gave them cigarettes. As the Ayesha raised her patched sails and headed into the vast Indian Ocean, the British telegraph operators cheered them on. The voyage of the Ayesha is one of the greatest survival stories in naval history. The ship leaked so badly that the pumps had to be manned 24 hours a day. The drinking water they had taken from the island turned foul in the iron tanks. The 50 men were crowded into a space meant for a crew of 5, yet von Mucke maintained strict naval discipline. Navigating with an old-school atlas and the stars, they managed to sail nearly 1,000 miles to the Dutch East Indies. There, in the port of Padang, they managed to rendezvous with a German merchant steamer, the Choising. Under the cover of darkness, they transferred to the steamer and scuttled the faithful Ayesha. But they couldn't go back to Germany by sea. The British Navy blocked the way. So they sailed to Yemen, on the edge of the Ottoman Empire, Germany's ally. They landed in the desert and began an overland trek that rivals the exploits of Lawrence of Arabia. They marched north through the burning sands, riding camels and donkeys. They were beset by thirst, disease, and heat. They were attacked by Bedouin tribesmen in fierce running battles that lasted for days. In one engagement, the sailors had to form a defensive square in the dunes, using their 2 salvage machine guns to hold off hundreds of Arab irregulars. Several men were killed, but they pushed on. They reached the Hejaz Railway, boarded a train, and finally in May 1915, 6 months after the Emden was destroyed, they arrived in Constantinople. They were the only unit of the German Navy to return home from overseas with their arms. When they arrived in Berlin, they were greeted as heroes. The Kaiser ordered that every surviving member of the Emden's crew be allowed to add the suffix -Emden to their surname, a hereditary honor that their descendants still carry today. Karl von Müller spent the rest of the war in captivity. He was imprisoned in England, where he led a daring escape attempt from the Sutton-Bonington camp in 1917, digging a tunnel and roaming the English countryside for days before being recaptured. He was eventually repatriated to Germany in 1918, his health permanently broken by malaria. He died in 1923, a quiet end for a man who had set the ocean on fire. But the legend of the Emden outlived him. For decades, the wreck of the ship lay on the reef at North Keeling Island, slowly beaten to pieces by the surf, a rusted iron monument to a different kind of war. The story of the SMS Emden resonates not just because of the ship she sank or the havoc she wreaked. It resonates because it feels like a eulogy for a lost world. It was a war of violence and strategic cunning, yes, but it was also a brief shining moment where humanity was not entirely lost amid the mechanics of destruction. It was a time when a captain could sink a ship and then shake the hand of its master, when a landing party could be cheered on by their enemies as they sailed into the unknown. In the end, the cruise of the Emden is a reminder that even in the total brutality of global conflict, honor is a choice. And Karl von Müller, the gentleman raider, chose to remain human.